Okay, so you're back for more deep dives, huh?
Well, you've definitely thrown us a curveball this time with this Honduran free zone law, this whole set of regulations. Specifically, we're talking about Acredo 41-2020.pdf. But hey, that's what we do here on the deep dive, right? We take these dense, complex documents and we try to break them down into something a little bit more digestible. So what we're really trying to do today is figure out just how these free zones in Honduras actually work, like in practice, and maybe even more importantly for you, how you can actually take advantage of them if you're, a business owner, an entrepreneur, or just someone who's interested in international trade.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. This document, it is dense, like you said, but it really is the foundation for a pretty big chunk of Honduras's economic strategy. And when I say it's got everything, I mean it. We're talking definitions of requirements, how you actually get authorized, what you got to do once you're in, how customs works, and even what happens if you, don't play by the rules.
And we're going to go through all of that together, step by step. And listen, it's not just about, reading the document word for word. We want to point out those little details, those nuances that you might miss on a first read-through. Like, for example, did you know that there are actually different roles you can play within a free zone? You could be an operadora, basically running the whole show, or an operadora usuaria, kind of like a player coach, or just a usuaria, which is more like setting up shop within an existing zone. Each one's got its own, pros and cons. And then, of course, we got to talk about the benefits. Why bother with all this if there's no upside? We'll cover how long these benefits last, and then we'll dive into those lovely customs procedures. Got to make sure everything's, above board. So maybe the best place to start is with the basics, right? Like, what exactly is a zona libre, according to all this legal mumbo-jumbo?
Well, Article 2's got you covered there. Basically, a zona libre, or free zone, is like, picture this: a specific area in Honduras. It's got clear boundaries. It's under the watchful eye of the government, especially when it comes to taxes. And here's the kicker: nobody actually lives there. It's all about business. Specifically, things like exporting stuff you make there, re-exporting stuff you bring in, doing international business online, that kind of thing. It's like a little global trade hub tucked away in Honduras.
So it's not just any old business park, right? And you mentioned different types of businesses or beneficiaries, I think you said. What's the deal with those? Like, how do they differ strategically?
All right, so Article 2 breaks it down like this. You've got three main players. First up, you've got the operadora. These guys are the big bosses, the ones who get to set up, run, and manage the whole free zone. Think of them as the developers, the ones building the infrastructure and making sure everything runs smoothly. Then you've got the operadora usuaria. It's a bit of a hybrid model, really. These entities, they not only manage the zone, but they also get to run their own businesses within it. So they wear two hats, which can be, interesting. And lastly, there's the usuaria. These are the companies that just set up shop within a zone that's already being run by an operadora or operadora usuaria. Their focus is purely on doing their business within the rules of the zone.
So just to make sure I'm getting this straight, if a company's main gig is making and exporting stuff, being an operadora usuaria might give them more control, right? And maybe even save them some money compared to being just a usuaria in a bigger zone with lots of other companies.
Yeah, exactly. It all depends on their strategy, How much control do they need? What are their cost considerations? It's a choice they're going to make.
Gotcha. Now, there's another term that pops up: area restringida. I'm guessing that's like the heart of the operation, right? The actual physical space.
You got it. Area restringida, or restricted area, is the actual zone, the place where all the action happens. It's where those beneficiary companies get to do their thing under this special set of rules, these tax breaks, all that good stuff. But here's the thing. Article 2 also throws in a little wrinkle. It says that an operator, under the right conditions, can actually ask for an ampliation or reducción de area, that's expansion or reduction of the area, and even an ampliation de nuevas zonas, adding entirely new free zones, maybe even in different locations. So there's room for growth, for specialization, all sorts of possibilities.
Okay, so we've got the lay of the land, the players. Now, let's say a company wants to get in on this action. What's the process? I'm seeing a lot of paperwork here, especially for those operadoras.
Yeah, no kidding. Chapter 3, all about requirements and procedure for authorization, goes deep on that. Let's tackle the operador first, the ones who want to run the whole zone. Article 3 lays out this massive list of stuff they got to submit. We're talking like a super detailed description of what their main business is going to be, all their contact info, how much money they're planning to invest, how many jobs they'll create, even down to what they'll be paying people. It's pretty clear the government wants to make sure these zones are, bringing in some serious economic benefits.
Right. They don't want just any fly-by-night operation. They want to see a solid plan, real jobs, real impact. What else is on that laundry list for wannabe operadores?
Buckle up, because there's more. They also need a proper map of the property signed off by a licensed engineer or architect. Got to show exactly where everything's going to be, even with the customs office. And, of course, they need proof that they actually own the land or have a long-term lease, at least 5 years. There's a little exception for, government entities, but for everyone else, got to own it or lease it. Then it's the usual corporate stuff. Copy of their tax ID, power of attorney for their reps, and their official incorporation document, the legal stuff that proves the company exists. Oh, and if it's a foreign company, got to prove they're allowed to do business in Honduras and that all their paperwork's properly registered.
So it's all about, dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Legally sound. Everything above board. Anything else specifically for foreign companies wanting to be operadores?
Oh yeah, one more thing. Foreign companies also have to show they've registered with the National Investment Council, the CNI. It's basically saying, hey, we're officially recognized as foreign investors in Honduras. And then, just a little extra, all applicants, no matter where they're from, have to designate at least one permanent legal rep, someone with, real authority, and got to do it officially with a notarized document. And they're obligated to keep that rep's info up to date. Lastly, they need those good old tax and customs solvency certificates showing they've paid their dues, literally. Got to make sure those copies are all legit, too.
Oh, and of course, there's a small fee to process the application. Yeah, it's a pretty intense process, but I guess they're trying to make sure only the serious players, the ones with the resources and the commitment, get to run a free zone.
Makes sense, I guess. It's a big deal. A lot of responsibility. Now, what about those operadores usuarias, the ones who manage and operate within a zone? Do they have to jump through even more hoops than a regular operadora? You know it. Article 3 gets even more specific for the operadoras usuarias. They got to do everything a regular operador does, plus they have to give a super detailed list of the products or services they'll be offering, who their target market is internationally, exactly what they'll be doing inside the zone, and even a 3-year projection of how much foreign currency they think they'll rake in. So they're basically saying, look, we can manage the zone, and we've got a rock-solid business plan for ourselves within it.
They're like the overachievers of the free zone world, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the regular usuarias, the ones who just want to set up shop in an existing zone? Do they have to go through this whole application process too? I don't see that in this section.
No, not at this stage. The initial authorization process, like we've been talking about, is really for the operadores and the operadores usuarias, the ones creating and managing the zones. For the usuarias, the ones just setting up shop, their registration happens a bit later, actually in Chapter 4, Article 13. But no matter what category you fall under, there's one big rule everyone has to follow, right? The export requirement.
Oh yeah, Article 4 is pretty clear about that. Most companies wanting to reap the benefits of these free zones, whether they're a usuaria or an operadora usuaria running their own show, they got to commit to sending at least 50% of their stuff, whether it's goods or services, to international markets. No getting around that.
You got it. Now, there are a few exceptions, like for those service companies that mainly cater to other businesses within the zone, or if they're providing online services to clients abroad. But the bottom line is, these zones are all about promoting exports, boosting international trade. Article 4 also makes it super clear that if you're already doing business in Honduras, paying your taxes, and selling all your stuff domestically, you can't just jump into a free zone for extra tax breaks. It's not designed for that.
So they're not just creating loopholes for existing businesses. They want to attract new international business, create something new. Now, let's say a company has all their ducks in a row, all that paperwork ready to go. How do they actually get authorized? What's the process laid out in Article 5?
It's all about following the steps. First, you send your complete application package to the Ministry of Economic Development. They don't mess around, they want everything. Once they have it, they pass it on to the General Directorate of Productive Sectors. Those guys are the ones who really dive into the details and issue a formal report. Sometimes, depending on the application and the proposed zone, they might even do an on-site inspection, with the customs folks, just to check things out in person. Then, the Ministry of Economic Development makes the final call. They issue a resolution that either approves or denies the application. And if you're lucky, you get the green light.
Okay, so you get the thumbs up, you're authorized, are you good to go? Can you just start doing business?
Hold your horses. Not so fast. There's still more to do. Once the resolution is final, meaning no more appeals or anything, the Ministry of Economic Development has 20 business days to send copies of all those crucial documents we talked about, the property plans, proof of ownership or lease, tax ID, incorporation papers, and for foreign companies, that CNI registration, they send all that, plus the authorization resolution to the customs folks. At the same time, the lucky applicant gets notified officially and receives their fancy certificate. But here's the kicker. Within 30 business days of getting that notification, those operadores and operadores usuarias have a whole bunch of stuff they got to do. They need to formally request to start operating within the customs computer system, and they have to sign a customs services contract with, well, the customs authority. It's basically the rule book for how customs will oversee their zone. And don't forget about that Registry of Exonerated, the list maintained by the Ministry of Finance that lets companies under these special regimes, like the free zones, actually claim their tax exemptions. They got to be registered there too. If they miss that 30-day deadline, the customs folks can actually report them to the Ministry of Economic Development for not following the rules.
Wow, so it's a real tightrope walk, got to hit all those deadlines, cross every T, dot every I, no room for error. And Article 6 has this interesting little tidbit. It says that the granted rights are personalissimos. What does that even mean? Like, practically speaking.
Personalissimos basically means the rights and privileges you get, whether you're an operador, operadora usuaria, or usuaria, are tied to you specifically, to that legal entity. You can't just hand them off to someone else, sell them, or transfer them in any way. It's like a personalized membership card, not transferable. This just reinforces the idea that the authorization is based on your qualifications, your business plan, your commitments.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about if you want to expand? Like, what if you're an operadora and you want to set up another free zone in a different location, or just make your existing zone bigger or smaller? Articles 7 and 8 touch on that, right?
Yeah, they do. So if you're already an operadora or an operadora usuaria and you want to create a whole new free zone in a different spot, the process is pretty much the same as starting from scratch. You might get a little break since you've already submitted some of the basic documents, but you still got to go through the whole thing again. And that customs services contract, yeah, that'll probably need some tweaking to cover the new zone. If you just want to adjust the size of your existing zone, make it bigger or smaller, it's a bit simpler. You just got to submit an updated map, officially certified, showing the new boundaries. And of course, you need to prove you own or lease that extra land, or that you're giving up the lease if you're shrinking the zone.
All right, so getting authorized is a whole journey in itself. But let's say you've made it, you're in. What are the rules of the game? What are the ongoing obligations once you're operating within a Honduran free zone? Chapter 4 and a few other articles lay out those responsibilities, right?
Right on. Article 9 starts with a pretty fundamental principle. If you're operating in a free zone, you're responsible for everything in your possession within that zone. I mean, you're responsible for keeping it safe, protecting it from damage or loss, you name it. Now, they do give you a little wiggle room for, like, natural disasters or, truly unforeseen events, as long as you didn't do anything wrong or negligent. But even then, you got to have proof, got to document everything.
So basically, due diligence is the name of the game.
Yeah.
Take care of your stuff. And then there's that custom services contract we keep hearing about. Article 10 highlights that. Why is it so important?
Think of it as the agreement between the customs authority and the folks running the zone. The operadoras or the operadoras usuarias. It's like a legally binding handshake that spells out exactly what each side is responsible for when it comes to customs control and, making sure everyone's paying their fair share within the zone. They even figure out how many customs officers need to be stationed there based on how much activity they expect. And for transparency's sake, copies of this contract got to be shared with a bunch of government agencies.
So everyone's on the same page. Everyone knows the rules. What about building the actual zone? Like, if you need to construct buildings and infrastructure, Article 11 sets some deadlines, right?
Yep, Article 11 lays down the law. If you need to build stuff, you basically have 3 months from the day you get your authorization to start construction on the essential parts of the zone. Now, if the buildings are already there, but you need to, modify them for the customs post or clearly mark the zone's boundaries, you've got 3 months for that too. They do allow for extensions, but you got to have a good reason, and they'll check up on you to make sure you're actually doing the work.
So no dragging your feet. Got to get things up and running. What if something happens and a company needs to temporarily shut down operations? Like, what's the protocol there?
Article 12 is all about keeping everyone informed. If you have to temporarily suspend your operations for whatever reason, you got to tell the Ministry of Economic Development right away in writing, and you need to give them an estimated date for when you think you'll be back up and running. They then pass the word along to other government agencies, so everyone's in the loop.
Now let's circle back to the usuarias, the companies setting up shop within an existing free zone. We touched on the registration process earlier, but Article 13 goes into detail. What do they actually have to do?
So after a usuaria finalizes their lease agreement with the operadora, or operadora usuaria, they have 15 business days to register with the General Directorate of Productive Sectors. And here's an interesting bit. The operadora can actually start this process for them, or the usuaria can do it themselves. To get the ball rolling, they need to fill out a form and provide a bunch of documents, kind of like what the operadoras have to submit their business activities, contact info, how much they plan to invest, how many jobs they'll create, all that good stuff. They also need a copy of their tax ID, their incorporation papers, and their legal reps details. And of course, got to include a copy of that signed lease agreement with the operadora. There might be some extra requirements depending on what kind of business they are. Like if they're a manufacturer, they need to say when they expect to start operations and how much they'll be exporting. Companies doing online services might need authorization from the telecommunications folks.
So the operador is there to help the usuarias get settled, but the usuarias also have the power to take charge of their own registration. What happens next? Once they've submitted everything to the General Directorate of Productive Sectors, what's the process like?
Article 14 lays it out. The General Directorate, they'll do a bit of investigating, usually an on-site visit to the usuaria's facilities. They just want to make sure everything matches up with what was submitted, that they're actually set up in the right place, within the authorized zone, and that they have what they need to do their business. If everything checks out, they'll officially register the usuaria and issue them a registration certificate. That certificate's super important because it's basically their permission slip to operate within the free zone. No other license needed. And within 20 business days of issuing the certificate, the General Directorate will send copies of everything, including the certificate, to the Customs Authority. So everyone's on the same page. Once the usuaria has that certificate in hand, boom, they can start doing business.
Sounds pretty straightforward, at least for the usuarias. Article 15 mentions something about getting set up in the customs computer system, right?
Right. So within 30 business days of getting that registration certificate, the usuaria has to get themselves set up in the National Customs computer system. It's all online these days. They have to request access to the system directly from the Customs Authority. And just like the operadoras and operadoras usuarias, they also need to make sure they're registered in the Registry of Exonerated over at the Ministry of Finance so they can actually get those tax breaks. Without access to that system, managing imports, exports, and all those customs procedures would be a nightmare.
And let's say usuaria wants to expand, maybe operate in another free zone. Article 16 seems to suggest they can do that.
Exactly. If a usuaria wants to set up shop in another restricted area, even in a different free zone, they can do that. They just have to go through that same registration process we talked about in Article 13 for each new location. So they're not limited to just one spot. They can branch out and grow their operations.
Now let's talk about the good stuff. The reason so many companies are interested in these free zones, the tax benefits. Article 17 focuses on income tax, and it looks like there have been some changes over time.
Yeah, there have. Article 17 clears up how income tax exemptions work now, especially with all the legal changes. So there used to be this 12-year exemption under an old law, but when a newer law, Decree Number 8/2020, came into effect in February 2020, that old exemption went out the window. But don't worry, it gets better. Article 17b of the current rules says that from the moment that new law came into effect, every company in a free zone automatically got a brand new 15-year exemption from paying income tax, plus they get exemptions from some other related taxes too. So it's like they hit the reset button and gave everyone a fresh start with even more time free from income tax.
So everyone got a 15-year tax holiday starting in 2020, essentially. And Article 17g even mentions the possibility of extending that exemption even further, right?
Right. If you've been playing by the rules and doing well, you can apply to extend those tax breaks for another 10 years on top of the initial 15. But it's not a free pass. You got to earn it. The Ministry of Economic Development will look at your export numbers from the past 5 years, how many jobs you've created, if you've made any additional investments, and your tax and customs track record. They want to see that you're contributing, pulling your weight.
So it's not just a handout. They're looking for results. Now, what about other regulations like health and safety, environmental stuff? Article 18 addresses that.
Right. So if you're dealing with anything that could potentially harm people or the environment, like chemicals, pharmaceuticals, food, that kind of thing, you got to play by all the rules. The Ministry of Economic Development, the customs folks, even the operadores themselves, they're all keeping an eye out. And if they find something wrong, they're obligated to report it to the authorities for further action.
So there's accountability built into the system. What happens when a company decides to close up shop, to stop operating within a free zone? Article 19 talks about that.
Yeah, if you decide to close down, you can't just disappear. Unless it's some totally unforeseen situation, you got to give written notice to the Ministry of Economic Development, the Ministry of Labor, and the Customs Authority at least 10 days before you shut down for good. And once your free zone benefits are officially canceled, the General Directorate of Productive Sectors will let the Customs and Finance folks know so they can do their final checks and close out your file, so to speak. If you don't give proper notice, well, you might face some penalties.
So there's a proper way to exit the system. Can't just ghost everyone. And Article 20 reminds us about registering with the Ministry of Finance's Registry of Exonerated to actually claim those tax breaks.
Right. If you want those tax benefits, you got to be on that list. You have 15 business days after your authorization becomes final to register with the Ministry of Finance. It's an essential step to actually activate those sweet tax advantages.
And to keep track of everyone, the Ministry of Economic Development has its own list, right? Article 21 mentions a registry of free zone beneficiary companies.
That's right. The General Directorate of Productive Sectors, they keep tabs on everyone who's been authorized to operate in a free zone. They use the authorization resolutions for the operadoras and operadoras usuarias and the registration certificates for the usuarias to make sure they have a complete record of every company operating under their watch.
Okay, now here's something interesting. Article 22 talks about companies that can operate within a free zone but don't get the tax benefits. Why would anyone do that?
Think of them as the support system. These are the companies that provide essential services to the companies actually benefiting from the free zone and to their employees. It could be anything. Restaurants, banks, convenience stores, the things that make life easier for the people working and living in the zone. They operate within the zone but don't get those tax breaks because their main focus is serving the free zone community, not necessarily international trade. The Ministry of Economic Development needs to know about these companies when they open and close. The operadora is responsible for notifying them within 15 business days of a new support service company setting up shop, and the support companies themselves have 30 days to report their closure. If they don't, they could face penalties.
So it's like a little ecosystem within the free zone. Now let's dive into the nitty-gritty of customs control. Chapter 5 is all about that, and it's pretty intense.
Yeah, customs is a big deal in a free zone. Article 34 gets right to the point. The whole area has to be physically secured. Walls or fences at least 3 meters high all the way around. You can't just wander in and out. And all entry and exit points are controlled by the Customs Authority. They even determine how many customs officers are needed based on how busy the zone is.
So it's like a fortress, but for trade. And Article 36 makes it clear that the Customs Authority is in charge, right? They call the shots when it comes to taxes and supervision.
Absolutely. The customs officers stationed at the free zone, they're the enforcers, making sure everyone follows the rules, both the free zone rules and the general customs rules for Honduras. They're constantly checking goods, vehicles, and people coming in and out, making sure everything's above board. But they're also supposed to, make things run smoothly, not create unnecessary roadblocks for legitimate businesses operating in the zone.
So it's a balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Article 37 says you can't just ship goods to any address within a free zone. There are rules about who can receive those goods, right?
Right. Any goods coming into a free zone have to be addressed to a company that's already officially authorized to operate under the free zone benefits. You can't just use the name of a company that's still waiting for approval. That's a big no-no and could get you in trouble.
So everything has to be legit, no shortcuts. Now, Article 38 gets into the actual process of bringing goods into a restricted area. And it looks like there are different procedures depending on where the goods are coming from.
Okay, so let's break it down. If the goods are coming from outside Honduras, they usually go straight from the port or airport to the free zone under what's called a Customs Transit Declaration. It's a special document with all sorts of details required by the Central American Uniform Customs Code. Then, once the goods arrive at the free zone, the company receiving them has to file a formal entry declaration with the Free Zone Customs Office. For goods coming from within Honduras, things get a little more complicated. If they were bought using a sales tax exemption order, the customs folks at the free zone have to confirm their arrival in the customs computer system. The company needs to show them copies of the exemption order and the invoice. Goods that are already exempt from sales tax because of some law, they still have to go through a customs procedure, and goods brought in specifically to be re-exported, they have to go through a formal procedure too, or maybe a simplified one if the customs authority has set one up. Even goods that were originally bought in Honduras with taxes already paid can be brought into a free zone, but you gotta prove you bought them legally.
Wow, so many different scenarios, but it sounds like they have a procedure for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a deadline for registering those entries, right?
10 business days. That's how long you have from the day the goods arrive to register them in the customs computer system. If you miss that deadline, you can still register them, but you'll have to pay a penalty. It's like a late fee, but for customs.
So stay organized and file those declarations on time. Now, Article 39 mentions something about transforming goods. If you bring national goods into a free zone and want to re-export them, they can't just stay the same.
Exactly. If you bring goods from Honduras into a free zone with the intention of sending them back out, those goods have to be transformed in some way while they're in the zone. It could be a physical transformation or an industrial process, but they can't just sit there unchanged. The customs folks will check to make sure the transformation happened before they give you the okay to re-export them under those free zone benefits.
So it's about adding value, not just using the zone as a storage facility. Now, Article 40 gets into how much of your stuff you can actually sell in Honduras, right? There are limits, and it looks like those limits are different for different types of companies.
That's right. For companies that mostly just re-export stuff, meaning they bring in finished goods and then send them back out without doing much to them, the amount they can sell in Honduras is based on how much they brought in initially. The customs authority tracks it carefully to make sure no one's going over their limit. For companies that are actually manufacturing stuff in the free zone, the limit is based on their total production volume for the year.
So different rules for different players. What about moving goods between companies within a free zone or even between different free zones in Honduras? Article 41 covers that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. You can definitely move goods between companies in the same zone or even to other free zones, but you got to follow the rules. The customs authority has to approve it, and there are specific procedures for both permanent transfers where ownership changes and temporary transfers where it doesn't. Mess up those procedures and you'll be facing those lovely penalties again.
So even moving stuff around has its own set of rules.
Yeah.
And Article 42 mentions that the customs folks can inspect anything they want, right?
Oh, yeah. They have the power to inspect goods coming in, going out, pretty much anything they want. They can do it on their own, or if another government agency asks them to. Usually they'll do it with a company representative present just to make sure everything's above board.
So they're keeping a close eye on things. Now, what about after-hours operations? Can you move goods in or out when the customs office is closed?
Article 43 says yes, but only in special situations. Like if there's some kind of emergency, a natural disaster, or something totally out of your control, they might also allow it if a company absolutely has to meet a deadline for a big contract, to keep things running smoothly. But it's not just a free-for-all. You got to have a good reason and get permission.
Okay, so no sneaking goods around in the middle of the night. Article 44 talks about exclusive distributors. What's that about?
It's all about protecting businesses operating in Honduras. If you're in a free zone and you want to sell your goods in Honduras, the customs folks will check to make sure no one else already has exclusive rights to distribute those goods in the country. It's about fair competition, making sure you're not undercutting existing businesses.
Leveling the playing field, I see. Now, let's talk about getting goods out of the free zone. Exporting them. What's the process there, according to Article 45?
Once your goods are ready to go, the customs authority at the free zone will authorize their departure. You'll need to file either an export declaration if the goods are made in Honduras, or a re-export declaration if they were originally imported. Then the goods are sent to the exit customs office, which could be at a border, a port, or an airport. Once they get there, the customs folks there will do their own checks and then give the final okay for the goods to leave Honduras.
So it's a multi-step process, but it makes sense. Now, what about if you want to sell those goods in Honduras instead of exporting them? Article 46 talks about using different customs regimes for that.
Right. So if you want to take goods from the free zone and sell them in Honduras, you have to follow the rules for regular imports. You have to pay the usual import duties and taxes, go through all the normal procedures, the whole 9 yards.
But Article 47 mentions an exception, right? Something about trade agreements.
Yes. If your goods qualify under certain trade agreements that Honduras has signed, you might be exempt from paying import tariffs. In those cases, you'll usually only have to pay taxes on the value that was added to the goods while they were in the free zone.
So that's a huge advantage for companies whose products qualify. Now, Article 48 talks about special areas for receiving, storing, and inspecting goods that are going to be imported into Honduras from the free zone. Article 49 then goes into detail about what those areas have to look like, what the requirements are.
They have to be secure, well-lit, well-ventilated, and clearly marked. They need walls or fences, and usually a roof, to prevent unauthorized access. They also need a designated access point so customs can easily control the flow of goods. The company has to request permission from the customs authority to set up one of these areas, and the customs folks will do an inspection before giving their approval.
And if a company does a lot of business selling goods in Honduras, Article 50 suggests